SPQR. Everything you thought you knew about Rome was a lie. 4 sacred letters, worshipped for centuries. But what if I told you they've lied to you? You've seen them on ancient ruins, etched into stone like divine scripture, glorified in films, textbooks, even tattoos. We were told it stood for justice, for democracy, for the voice of the Roman people. But it didn't. It never did. SPQR was a weapon, a smokescreen, a beautifully engineered illusion used to control minds, conquer nations, and crown dictators in the robes of republic. Because Rome wasn't ruled by its people, it was ruled by shadows. Behind every temple and triumphal arch, there was a senate not of statesmen, but of syndicates. A republic not of law, but of bloodlines. And those 4 letters, they didn't mean freedom. They meant control. This is not the Rome you learned in school. This is the empire behind the empire. Welcome to Shadows of Ancient History, and today we rip the mask off the most powerful lie ever sold in the name of civilization. The early Roman Republic was born in the ashes of a monarchy. At least, that's what the legend claims. In 509 BCE, the people supposedly rose up against their last king, Tarquin the Proud, casting off the yoke of tyranny and vowing never again to submit to one man's will. In his place, they created a senate and a pair of consuls, equal rulers to serve the public interest. It was a triumph of liberty, or so they said. But peel back the wax tablets and temple inscriptions, and a different image begins to form. This wasn't a grassroots revolution, it was an aristocratic coup. The men who dethroned Tarquin weren't commoners. They were the patricians, Rome's old bloodlines. And when the crown fell, they didn't shatter it. They sliced it into pieces and shared it among themselves. The Senate, or Senatus, wasn't a parliament of equals. It was a private club. Admission came not through votes, but through lineage and influence. While consuls were technically elected, the candidates were almost always drawn from a tight-knit circle of noble families. Names like the Julii, the Cornelii, the Claudii, they dominated the ballots like dynasties do today. The people may have voted, but their choices were carefully curated. Historians still debate whether the Republic was ever truly democratic. What's clear is that SPQR Senatus Populusque Romanus was less a representation of shared power and more a political theater mask designed to make empire look like consensus. It was painted on standards, carved into monuments, and minted into coins to suggest unity between the Senate and the people. But that unity was largely fictional. The Senate ruled, and the people followed so long as the illusion held. Behind the marble colonnades of the Curia, Rome's senators acted more like feudal lords than civil servants. They traded votes for favors, hoarded land, and manipulated magistracies to serve their class interests. The laws they passed often protected their own wealth, while punishing debtors and curbing the ambitions of upstart plebeians. Even the famed 12 Tables, the earliest Roman laws, were codified under pressure, not generosity. In 450 BCE, plebeians threatened to secede from Rome entirely if their grievances weren't addressed. The patricians caved, but only just enough to keep the republic intact. It was a calculated concession, not a moral awakening, and yet SPQR continued to fly high. One strange yet telling tale appears in 390 BCE during the Gallic sack of Rome. According to Roman legend, the senators refused to flee. Instead, they dressed in ceremonial robes and waited silently in their marble seats as the Gauls entered the city. They were allegedly slaughtered without resistance. Some see this as an act of defiance. Others view it as a mythologized performance, Rome clinging to its own illusion of control, even in collapse. This wasn't just pride, it was obsession. The Senate's authority came not from its competence, but from its continuity. As long as SPQR remained visible, the power it represented could survive, even if the people didn't understand the game. And so, the facade endured. New senators replaced the fallen, new laws preserved old power. The outer trappings of a republic, assemblies, ballots, public forums, continued to operate, like gears in a well-oiled machine. But the hands that turned them remained the same. Rome marched onward, conquering neighbors and expanding its territory. With each victory, generals returned not just with spoils, but with new narratives. "We did this for the people," they declared. "We fight under the banner of SPQR." But those victories came at a cost. And behind the Golden Eagle standard, the old men of the Senate counted their profits. They called it amicizia, friendship. But this Roman version of alliance was anything but sentimental. Behind closed atriums and shaded porticos, amicizia bound senators, generals, and rising magistrates into webs of obligation far tighter than any written law. These weren't friendships of the heart. They were power pacts, secured with favors, oaths, marriages, and sometimes blood. A senator rarely rose by merit alone. He needed backing financial, familial, and often criminal. A young patrician might begin his career as a quaestor, but he wouldn't get far without aligning himself with a patron, an older, wealthier senator who would provide support in exchange for lifelong loyalty. This wasn't mentorship, it was sponsorship. Roman style. Think less internship, more mafia initiation. Historians still debate how formalized these networks were, but the effects are clear in the careers of men like Lucius Cornelius Sulla. He began as a low-status patrician with few resources, but by allying himself with the general Marius, then later betraying him, he carved a path to dictatorship. His ascent was paved with shifting alliances, political assassinations, and a purge of his enemies so brutal it made even seasoned senators tremble. His proscriptions, kill lists published in the Forum, were both a warning and an invitation. Support Sulla and you might live. Oppose him and your name could be next. But not all threats were so direct. More often, the Senate operated through softer forms of control, social debt, public shame, strategic exile. If a senator stepped out of line, his peers might not kill. While they might simply ruin his career, block his elections, or orchestrate a scandal that would force him to flee Rome altogether. It was cleaner, more civilized, and no less lethal to ambition. Even stranger was the practice of political adoption. In Republican Rome, adoption wasn't just about giving a child a family. It was a tactic used to merge noble houses and transfer political capital. Julius Caesar himself was posthumously adopted by his great-uncle, who happened to be a god, Divus Julius. This made Caesar's heir, Octavian, not only the son of a god, but also a symbol of Rome's divine continuity. Convenient, powerful, entirely constructed. And then there were the gangs. Rome's political factions weren't just debating societies. They had muscle, real muscle. Men like Clodius Pulcher, a populist tribune, maintained private militias that patrolled the streets, broke up rival assemblies, and even burned down the Curia, the Senate house itself, in 52 BCE. His rival Milo did the same. Their street battles weren't just urban chaos, they were tactical moves in larger political wars, fought not in the Senate but on the stones of the Via Sacra. SPQR still flew above it all, of course. The senators made sure of that. No matter how violent things became, how corrupt the offices, how brazen the bribery, the symbol of shared power remained untouched. It was as if Rome could tolerate any crime, so long as its banner stayed clean. One peculiar incident in 133 BCE shows how this illusion was maintained. Tiberius Gracchus, a tribune of the people, proposed redistributing land from the wealthy to Rome's poor. A noble cause at first glance, but the Senate saw something else, a breach of protocol, a threat to their monopoly on reform. They didn't assassinate him in the dead of night. They clubbed him to death in public, during a session of the assembly using furniture from the Senate itself. The murder shocked Rome, but it also sent a message. The Senate's power would not be undermined, even if it meant spilling blood beneath the statue of Jupiter. In the aftermath, the Senate claimed Gracchus had been aiming for kingship, that his death was a defense of the Republic, a defense of SPQR. Never mind the mob. Never mind the corpse in the forum, the illusion remained. These weren't the actions of public servants. They were the rituals of a ruling class fighting to preserve its dominance, not through public service, but through loyalty, control, and fear. By now, the Senate resembled less a deliberative body and more a syndicate. Its members shared power not equally but tribally. They divided spoils, controlled votes, and enforced order with the help of clients and co-conspirators. Some historians have compared the Senate to a cartel, complete with territories, enforcers, and codes of silence. And like any good cartel, it knew the value of spectacle. The public saw the marble, the togas, the processions. They heard the speeches, the oaths, the invocations of ancient gods. But behind the veil, old families whispered names over wine, plotted marriage alliances, and promised favors that would one day become demands. And so the Republic endured not because it was fair or even functional, but because its illusion was constantly reinforced. With blood, with alliances, with a banner that read, Senatus Populusque Romanus, a lie still etched in stone. If Rome was a stage, then the Roman people were the audience cheering, booing, and voting, but never writing the script. And by the late Republic, the Senate had mastered the art of keeping them entertained. They called it panem et circenses, bread and circuses. But don't let the phrase fool you. This wasn't generosity, it was strategy. As the Republic expanded, so too did its urban poor. Thousands of displaced farmers, war veterans, and freed slaves crowded into Rome's tenement slums. They had no land, no wealth, and no say except one. They could vote, and their votes, once worthless, suddenly became precious. Rome's powerful families realized that winning elections didn't mean winning debates. It meant winning crowds. Enter the populares, a faction of senators who bypassed the Senate altogether and appealed directly to the masses. They handed out grain, funded gladiator games, and paraded through the streets like kings in Republican clothing. Historians still debate whether these tactics were democratic innovation or cynical manipulation. But there's no debate about their effectiveness. When Gaius Gracchus, brother of the murdered Tiberius, revived the land reform movement, he didn't just introduce policy, he offered Rome's poor a vision, one where the Republic served them too. He built roads, offered subsidized grain, created new colonies, and in doing so, he terrified the Senate. They couldn't kill him in public again, not so soon. So they waited, spread rumors, undermined his support, and when the time came, they declared martial law, chased him to a sacred grove, and cut him down along with 3,000 of his followers. It wasn't called war, it was called restoring order. All done, of course, under the watchful eye of SPQR. But the genie was out. The people had tasted power, or at least the illusion of it. And now, ambitious men realized they could ride that illusion to real authority. One of them was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus Pompey the Great. A military genius with little patience for the Senate's pomp, he funded lavish games, distributed land to veterans, and built Rome's first permanent theater, a bold, even scandalous act. He said it was for the people, but the statue of himself that stood atop the complex told a different story. This wasn't charity, it was branding. Even stranger was the way the Senate responded. They hated Pompey's populism, but they also feared his popularity. So in a bizarre compromise, they made him consul without a colleague, breaking centuries of tradition just to keep him inside the system. Better to let the lion roam the palace than risk him building a kingdom of his own. And then came Julius Caesar. If Pompey understood the people, Caesar spoke their language. He threw the biggest games, offered the deepest grain subsidies, and most importantly, he gave them victories. When he returned from conquering Gaul, he wasn't just a general. He was a celebrity. He also knew how to stage a moment. In 59 BCE, during his first consulship, he introduced an agrarian law to distribute land to the poor. The Senate tried to block it. So Caesar took the proposal straight to the people, bypassing the chamber entirely. When a senator objected, stories spread that Caesar had him dragged out, though historians remain divided on the truth of this episode. Whether it happened or not, the tale became part of his growing legend, a man who no longer debated Rome's traditions but dismissed them. Caesar had declared that the will of the people outweighed the Senate's pride. It was a turning point. The Republic still functioned technically, but its organs were being rewired. Elections were decided by spectacle. Laws were passed by mob pressure. And through it all, SPQR kept shining on standards, on temples, on the very coins that paid for Caesar's games. One peculiar incident shows how thin the mask had become. During one of Caesar's public festivals, his co-consul Bibulus tried to block a motion by declaring the omens unfavorable, a religious technicality that, in theory, invalidated all political activity for the day. Caesar ignored him. Bibulus retreated to his house and refused to leave for the rest of his term. From that point on, people joked that Rome was governed not by two consuls, but by Julius and Caesar. Still, no one stopped the games or the grain or the gladiators. The people cheered, the senators schemed, and the symbol of SPQR fluttered above it all like a well-polished mask. Rome had turned voting into theater, and the audience had front-row seats, free bread, and no idea who was really directing the play. Even when Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, the Senate didn't restore the Republic. They performed the ritual, stood in the Curia, stabbed the tyrant, but the Republic didn't rise. It staggered, bleeding into chaos. Civil war erupted, factions formed, and once again, the people waited for someone to feed them, lead them, and entertain them. Octavian Caesar's heir answered that call, but he didn't restore the Senate's power. He restored the illusion. And SPQR? It still flew, higher than ever, because symbols, once embedded in the heart of a people, don't need truth to survive. Just spectacle, just hunger, just the illusion of a choice. The Curia. Julia stood quiet, its marble steps worn by decades of sandaled feet, its columns chipped by time and politics. Inside, the air was heavy with incense and secrets. It was here that senators debated the fate of provinces, passed edicts, and staged trials that were anything but fair. If the Forum was Rome's stage, the Senate was its smoke-filled backroom. Corruption wasn't an accident of the system, it was the system. Trials were nominally public, but in practice they were performances. Witnesses were coached, judges were bribed, outcomes were known before the first oath was sworn. Rome had laws, thousands of them. But what mattered more were the laws of influence. Who sponsored whom? Whose coin paid for the prosecution? Whose enemies needed silencing this season? Historians still debate whether the Senate's judicial power ever served justice or merely politics. But there's little debate about its use as a weapon. Take the case of Verres, the notorious governor of Sicily. His thefts, abuses, and violence were so egregious that even his fellow senators couldn't ignore them. Yet when Cicero prosecuted him in 70 B, Verres fled into exile before the trial ended, not because he feared guilt, but because he knew the Senate might still acquit him, unless the public got too loud. It was less a courtroom than a stage, and Verres simply refused to act in the finale. Behind these performances, another weapon thrived: delation, the use of informants. A senator could be ruined by a whisper, destroyed by a friend, or outmaneuvered by a servant with ears. Some informants were paid, others acted out of vengeance. Either way, they kept the upper class in check, not through honor, but through fear. More subtle still were the silences. Sometimes a man wasn't condemned, he was simply erased, denied political office, ignored at votes, passed over for appointments. It was death by irrelevance, a kind of living exile within the heart of power. And sometimes the knives were literal. One strange but revealing event occurred in 52 BCE. After years of escalating street violence between the gangs of Clodius and Milo, their feud erupted on the Appian Way. Clodius was killed in broad daylight, allegedly in a random skirmish. But the aftermath betrayed its political meaning. The Senate building was burned in protest. Rome plunged into chaos. Milo was eventually tried for murder, but not before Pompey was granted special powers to restore order. This pattern violence followed by consolidation would repeat again and again. By now, many senators carried bodyguards. Some even refused to attend sessions unless escorted. The Curia, once a symbol of reasoned debate, had become a battleground of nods, signals, and invisible threats. Debates weren't won, they were survived. One peculiar example, though debated, was how the Senate treated reform-minded voices like Cato the Younger. A staunch opponent of corruption and autocracy, Cato was often sidelined, shouted down in debates, and ultimately driven to political isolation. He refused to compromise. And when Caesar rose, Cato fell by his own hand, not in despair, but in defiance. A final, silent scream for a republic already gasping for air. But not all exits were silent. Some senators, realizing the futility of reform, turned to darker methods. Poisonings became so frequent in certain circles that Rome established special laws against beneficium. Yet accusations were hard to prove. A senator dead from fever might simply have offended the wrong house. The Senate knew this, of course. It needed fear to regulate itself. Without fear, the old men in togas would have to rely on respect, and that was growing scarce. Even stranger were the political funerals. When powerful senators died, their funerals became battlegrounds for propaganda. Speeches were crafted not to honor the dead, but to send messages to the living. This man served the republic, someone might say. But what they meant was, we're still in control. Or perhaps, step out of line, and you too will become a symbol. Still through all of it, SPQR endured. The Senate kept the symbol close, not because it described reality, but because it disguised it. Coins bore the letters, even as bribes flowed beneath the tables that minted them. Temples displayed them, even as priests were chosen for their connections. Military standards raised them, even as generals defied the Senate's authority altogether. The final irony? The Senate itself rarely discussed SPQR. It didn't need to. Like a mafia don never uttering omerta, the power of the symbol lay in its unspoken weight. It cloaked the republic in righteousness, even as knives glinted behind every cloak. By 44 BCE, when Julius Caesar returned from his Gallic campaigns, he found a Senate that was both cowed and complicit. They had granted him extraordinary powers, celebrated his victories, and turned a blind eye to his consolidations. When they finally struck him down, it was not for tyranny, but for eclipsing the Senate's illusion of control. They murdered the man. But the empire marched on, and SPQR, it was etched deeper than ever. When Octavian stood before the Senate in 27 BCE, he performed something calculated to appear unthinkable. He claimed to give back his power, or so it seemed to those who still believed in the Republic's theater. In a grand performance of humility, he declared that his extraordinary powers granted during Rome's years of civil war would be relinquished, that the Republic would be restored, that the Senate and the people would rule again. The chamber erupted in applause, and then, in the very next breath, they handed him a new title, Augustus, the revered one. Not a king, not a dictator, something more subtle, more permanent. Historians still debate whether Augustus was the first true emperor or merely the last republican. But what they agree on is this: his genius lay not in domination, but in disguise. He understood something the assassins of Caesar never did: power need not declare itself. If cloaked in ceremony, tradition, and just enough flattery, it can reign without resistance. And so the Senate was preserved as theater. Elections continued, laws were passed, speeches were made, but all decisions traced back to one man. Not because he claimed to be ruler, but because everyone else acted as if he were. The Principate was born a new regime hidden inside old skin. Ironically, SPQR became more visible than ever, emblazoned across temples, triumphal arches, and military standards precisely as its political meaning was emptied out. It flew on standards from Britannia to Judea, but it no longer meant what it once had. It had become, finally, a brand. Augustus, and those who followed him treated SPQR not as a symbol of shared power, but as a seal of legitimacy. Conquests were waged in its name, taxes were levied under its banner, and rebellions were crushed while invoking its authority. By the time of Emperor Tiberius, senators were little more than ceremonial participants. They debated laws already written. They confirmed appointments already decided. The emperor might occasionally consult them, but never need them. One peculiar event illustrates the shift. In 14 CE, after Augustus died, the Senate was summoned to deliberate on his successor. But the outcome was preordained. Tiberius, already adopted and empowered, merely hesitated in public ritual. He expressed reluctance. The Senate pleaded, repeating the charade Augustus had crafted decades earlier. It was no longer politics. It was liturgy. And yet, SPQR still framed the scene. Documents were still issued in its name. Armies still marched under its letters. The illusion was complete. The Senate, once a cartel of aristocrats, had become a court of flatterers. And the people? They still believed they had a voice. After all, the symbols were unchanged. The rituals endured, only the substance had vanished. By the 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire stretched from the Scottish highlands to the sands of Arabia. Millions lived under its rule, but only a handful held real power. The emperors chose who sat in the Senate. They decided which laws mattered. They appointed governors, generals, and even priests. And still SPQR flew. It was painted onto the shields of the legions, inscribed into stone milestones along the Appian Way, chiseled into the altars of distant provinces. But to many of those who saw it, it no longer meant Senate and people. It meant Rome, a city, a master, an idea. Even stranger was how the Senate's own members adapted. Some clung to the past, reciting ancient laws, insisting on the dignity of their role. Others embraced their new status, becoming administrators, financiers, or poets. A few became assassins in togas, conspiring to restore the Republic, only to meet the fate of so many before them: exile, execution, or oblivion. The final act came slowly. By the 3rd and 4th century CE, the Senate still existed, but as an echo. It no longer governed. It no longer decided. It no longer mattered. And yet, SPQR endured. When Constantine founded his new Rome in the East, even he, an emperor who saw visions and bent Christianity to his will, preserved a Senate in Constantinople. It had no real power, but it had the look of authority. And that by then was all anyone needed. The Western Senate limped on until 476 CE, when the last Roman emperor was deposed by a barbarian general. The city, the empire, the world they knew collapsed. And SPQR? It was never formally abolished because by then, there was no republic left to end and no Senate with the power to say goodbye. Because illusions don't need empires, they only need memory. In the end, the Senate didn't fall. It faded. Its power was never truly stripped away. It was emptied out, like wine from an amphora, slowly, silently, until only the shape remained. And that shape, gilded by SPQR, continued to shimmer. Because symbols polished by repetition and ritual often outlive the truths they were once built upon. They grow larger than facts and quieter than memory. They pass from generation to generation, carved into coins, whispered in oaths, stitched into flags. They become sacred not for what they mean, but for how often they've been seen. Rome understood this better than most. The Senate didn't need to rule so long as it appeared to. The people didn't need to choose so long as they felt they had. The Republic didn't need to exist so long as SPQR still crowned its temples and marched at the head of every legion. And so the lie endured, not out of malice, not even out of deceit, but because it was beautiful. Because it made order feel like justice, conquest feel like destiny, power feel like permission. And maybe, because we wanted to believe it. So the next time you see those letters on a ruin, a replica, a Roman movie poster, don't just think of ancient glory. Think of silence dressed as virtue. Think of power behind a curtain. Because SPQR wasn't just Rome. It was every empire that pretends to listen. A mask, a mirror, and maybe your reflection.